Well, good evening. Tonight's talk is about Lord Knyvett of Stanwell and the Gunpowder plot. So here's a cartoon, a map cartoon from the Daily Telegraph on the Friday, the 21st of October this year, the day after Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. And there's nothing in there to say that that's Guy Fawkes in the Houses of Parliament cellars, but of course we all know it is, because the Gunpowder plot of 1605 is one of those few historical events, like, say, the Battle of Hastings and the Magna Carta, that most people have actually heard of, even if they don't know the details. So you can see that it's still over 400 years later, still got that resonance, and it can still be linked to a political story these days, which is quite incredible when you think about it. Now, we don't have any contemporary pictures of Lord Knyvett, unfortunately, but this is the Knyvett coat of arms. Thomas Knyvett was born in 1545 at Escrick in Yorkshire. He was the second son of Sir Henry Knyvett by Anne, daughter and heiress of Sir Christopher Pickering of Killingdon, Westmoreland. He was educated at Jesus College at Cambridge and became a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to Queen Elizabeth. At court, he maintained a long-running feud with Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Knyvett's niece, Anne Vavasour, who was a lady of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth I, was the Earl's mistress, and on the 21st of March 1581 bore his illegitimate son, Edward Vere, at the palace, whereupon de Vere was exiled from court and briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London. Their love affair also led to open skirmishes and duels in the streets of London between Thomas Knyvett and Oxford, which on one occasion led to the wounding of both men and the death of one of Oxford's servants. Now, another interesting political connection with Lord Knyvett is that the first domestic house known to have been built on the site of number 10 Downing Street was a large building leased to Sir Thomas Knyvett. The house was first leased to him in 1581 by Queen Elizabeth I. As we've heard, he was one of the Queen's favourites and he held high rank in her court. He was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and in 1581 became the Queen's keeper of the palace. Royal patronage continued under James I, who knighted Knyvett in 1604. His lifetime lease on the house was extended in 1604 so that Sir Thomas's heirs would hold the property for 60 years after his death. It was then named Knyvett House, and the building was made of timber and brick and had a large L-shaped garden. After the deaths of Knyvett and his wife in 1622, the house passed to their niece, Elizabeth Hampden, who lived there for the next 40 years. One of the earliest descriptions of the house on today's Downing Street survives from the 17th century. The parliamentary commissioners who took over the Crown lands during the Commonwealth described the house in 1650. Built part with brick and part with timber and Flemish wall, and covered with tile, consisting of a large and spacious hall, wainscoted round, well lighted and paved with brick pavements. Two parts whereof one is wainscoted round from the ceiling to ye floor, one buttery, one cellar, one large kitchen well paved with stone, and well fitted and jointed, and well fitted with dresser boards. And above stairs in the first story, one large and spacious dining room, wainscoted round from the ceiling to the floor, well floored, lighted and sealed, and fitted with a fair chimney with a footplace of painted tile in the same. Also 6 more rooms and 3 closets in the same floor, all well lighted and sealed. And in the second story, 4 garrets. So here's a rock map of Middlesex in 1754, because in 1603, the freehold of the Manor of Stanwell was granted to Thomas Knyvett. The house he inherited dated back to medieval times and stood on the site of the later Stanwell Place, which was demolished in the 1960s for gravel raising. And you can see Stanwell is pretty well in the corner of this slide. This is Stanwell Village in the middle here, and this is the Stanwell Park estate where Knyvett's estate was up to the left here. He owned various agricultural lands around it, but that was the sort of centre of the house and gardens there, just out to the west of the village and just on the boundary really of Heathrow Airport today. Now here's a portrait of King James I by Daniel Mytons, dating from 1621. It's from the National Portrait Gallery. James VI of Scotland, as he was, came to the throne of England in 1603 after the death of the childless Elizabeth I. Ironically, he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed. In December 1603 and January 1604, Knyvett had orders from King James concerning jewels that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. On Christmas Eve 1603, he brought to Hampton Court some chests of jewels which he had kept at Westminster Palace, and he also took some to others to a jeweller to exchange for a new piece with a large table ruby and 2 great lozenge diamonds. Now, coming to the Gunpowder plot itself. The Gunpowder plot of 1605 was an assassination attempt against King James by a group of provincial English Catholics led by Robert Catesby, who sought to restore the Catholic monarchy to England after decades of persecution against Catholics. The plan was to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on the 5th of November 1605, as the prelude to a popular revolt in the Midlands, during which King James's 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was to be installed as the Catholic head of state. Catesby may have embarked on the scheme after hopes of securing greater religious tolerance under King James had faded, leaving many English Catholics disappointed. His fellow conspirators were John and Christopher Wright, Robert and Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, Sir Everard Digby and Francis Tresham, and you can see some of them in this illustration here. Guy Fawkes himself, who had 10 years of military experience fighting in the Spanish Netherlands in the failed suppression of the Dutch revolt, was given charge of the explosives. Now, this is an early 19th century illustration of the east end of the Prince's Chamber, which is on the extreme left here, and the east wall of the House of Lords in the centre, which was their target, obviously. The first meeting between the 5 original conspirators took place on the 20th of May 1604, probably at the Duck and Drake Inn just off the Strand in London, Thomas Winter's usual residence when staying in London. Catesby, Thomas Winter and John Wright were in attendance, joined by Guy Fawkes and Thomas Percy. Alone in a private room, the 5 plotters swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. Following their oath, the plotters left London and returned to their homes. On the 9th of June, Percy's patron, the Earl of Northumberland, appointed him to the Honourable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms, a mounted troop of 50 bodyguards to the king. This role gave Percy reason to seek a base in London and a small property near the Prince's Chamber. Fawkes, using the pseudonym John Johnson, took charge of the building, posing as Percy's servant. The building was occupied by Scottish commissioners appointed by the king to consider his plans for the unification of England and Scotland. So the plotters hired Catesby's lodgings in Lambeth on the opposite bank of the Thames, from where their stored gunpowder and other supplies could be conveniently rowed across each night. Meanwhile, King James continued with his policies against the Catholics, and Parliament pushed through anti-Catholic legislation until its adjournment on the 7th of July. Now here's a map of the Houses of Parliament, again from a rock map of London in 1746. And you can see this is the House of Lords marked in red at the bottom of the slide there. This is obviously not the House of Commons as we have today, Parliament as we have today, but you can see Westminster Hall at the top here is the only part of that building which still survives to the present day, and of course where the Queen lay in state recently. This is William Capen's map of Parliament, and it clearly labels the Undercroft, it says here, and known as Guy Fawkes, or let's misspell his name, cellar, and that's obviously the Undercroft where the gunpowder was stored. On the 25th of March 1605, the plotters purchased the lease to the Undercroft, owned by John Wynyard. The Palace of Westminster in the early 17th century was a warren of buildings clustered around the medieval chambers, chapels and halls of the former royal palace that housed both Parliament and the various royal law courts. The old palace was easily accessible. Merchants, lawyers and others lived and worked in the lodgings, shops and taverns within its precincts. Wynyard's building was along a right angle to the House of Lords, alongside a passageway called Parliament Place, which itself led to Parliament Stairs and the River Thames. Undercrofts were common features at the time, used to house a variety of materials, including food and firewood. Wynyard's undercroft on the ground floor was directly beneath the first floor House of Lords and may once have been part of the palace's medieval kitchen. Unused and filthy, its location was ideal for what the group planned to do. Here's an illustration of the undercroft beneath the House of Lords as illustrated in 1799. At about the same time, it was described as 77 feet long, 24 feet and 4 inches wide and 10 feet high. According to Fawkes, 20 barrels of gunpowder were brought in at first, followed by 16 more on the 20th of July. The supply of gunpowder was theoretically controlled by the government, but it was easily obtained from illicit sources. On the 28th of July, the ever-present threat of the plague again delayed the opening of Parliament, this time until Tuesday the 5th of November. Fawkes left the country for a short time. The king, meanwhile, spent much of the summer away from the city hunting. He stayed wherever was convenient, including on occasion at the houses of prominent Catholics. It is uncertain when Fawkes returned to England, but when he was back in London by late August, when he and Wintour discovered that the gunpowder stored in the undercroft had decayed because of damp, more gunpowder was brought into the room along with firewood to conceal it. On the evening of the 26th of October 1605, the Catholic Lord Monteagle received an anonymous letter warning him to stay away from Parliament during the opening. And you can see here, this is the actual letter, which is still in the National Archives, and the text there: "My Lord, out of the love I bear to you, some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be contemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." Well, Monteagle apparently didn't know what to make of this letter, although it seems fairly clear, and he promptly rode to Whitehall and handed it to Robert Cecil, then Earl of Salisbury, who was James's chief minister. The letter was shown to the king on Friday the 1st of November, following his arrival back in London. Upon reading it, James immediately seized on the word blow and felt that it hinted at some stratagem of fire and powder, perhaps an explosion exceeding the violence of the one that killed his father, Lord Darnley, at Kirk-of-Field in Scotland in 1567. The following day, members of the Privy Council visited the king at the Palace of Whitehall and informed him that, based on the information that Salisbury had given them a week earlier, on Monday, the Lord Chamberlain Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, would undertake a search of the Houses of Parliament, both above and below. Now, this is a Victorian painting of the discovery of the gunpowder plot and the taking of Guy Fawkes by Henry Perronet Briggs. And actually, this is Lord Knyvett in the breastplate and the red coat in the foreground of the picture, and Guy Fawkes in the black hat at the rear there. So the first search of the buildings in and around Parliament was made on Monday, the 4th of November, as the plotters were busy making their final preparations, by Suffolk, Monteagle and John Wynyard. They found a large pile of firewood in the undercroft underneath the House of Lords, accompanied by what they presumed to be a serving man, Fawkes, who told them that the firewood belonged to his master, Thomas Percy. They left to report their findings, at which time Fawkes also left the building. The mention of Percy's name aroused further suspicion, as he was already known to the authorities as a Catholic agitator. The King insisted that a more thorough search be undertaken. Late that night, the search party, headed by Thomas Knyvett, returned to the Undercroft. They again found Fawkes dressed in a cloak and a hat and wearing boots and spurs. He was arrested, whereupon he gave his name as John Johnson. He was carrying a lantern, which is now held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, and a search of his person revealed a pocket watch, several slow matches and touchwood. 36 barrels of gunpowder were discovered hidden under piles of faggots and coal. Fawkes was taken to the King early on the morning of the 5th of November. Now, this is Guy Fawkes' subsequent confession. Over the next 2 days, he was tortured at the Tower of London by order of the King until he confessed. And you can see his very shaky signature just added underneath the word good there, very slight. Obviously, after he'd been tortured, he was not up to writing much, and the other witnesses had put their names down here. So his fellow plotters, after Fawkes' arrest, fled north to the Midlands until the authorities caught up with them at Holbeach House in Staffordshire. They had some gunpowder with them, which had got damp, and they tried to dry it in front of the fire, but then that exploded, injuring several of them. Richard Walsh, who was the Sheriff of Worcestershire, and his company of 200 men besieged Holbeach House on the morning of 8th November. Thomas Winter was hit in the shoulder while crossing the courtyard. John Wright was shot, followed by his brother. Catesby and Percy were reportedly killed by a single lucky shot. The attackers rushed the property, and Grant, Morgan, Rookwood and Winter were arrested. Now, this is a scene of the execution of some of the plotters by Class, Gents, Fisher. The trials at Westminster Hall were a foregone conclusion. Besides the conspirators, Catholic priest Father Henry Garnet was also accused of conspiracy, which gave the authorities an excuse to claim the whole plot was inspired by Jesuits and justify continuing repression of the Roman Catholic religion. Although Catesby and Percy escaped the executioner, having been killed in the siege, their bodies were exhumed and decapitated, and the heads exhibited on spikes outside the House of Lords. On the 30th of January 1606, Everard Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant and Thomas Bates were dragged through the streets on hurdles to St Paul's Churchyard, where they were hanged, drawn and quartered. The following day, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes and Guy Fawkes suffered the same fate at Old Palace Yard at Westminster, opposite the building they had planned to blow up. Although weakened by his torture, Fawkes managed to jump from the gallows and break his neck, thus avoiding the agony of the gruesome latter part of his execution. Father Henry Garnet's execution took place on the 3rd of May 1606. After foiling the plot, Knyvett was appointed a Privy Councillor, member of the Council to Queen Anne, the wife of James I, and Warden of the Mint. The King confided his daughter, Mary, to him to be educated. And on the 4th of July 1607, he was summoned to Parliament as Baron Knyvett of Escrick in Yorkshire, where he'd been born. And this is a plan of the Escrick estate, as you can see here in Yorkshire. It's just to the south of York. About the same time. The Knyvett family, in fact, had held Escrick since the early 16th century, when the heiress Anne Pickering had married Sir Henry Knyvett. In 1613, Knyvett was also granted the manor of Staines by the Crown, but did not have a residence there as he did in Stanwell. Now, unfortunately, during the time that he was looking after the Princess Mary, she died at Stanwell on the 16th of December 1607, aged 2, and her sister Sophia had died the previous year at only 1 day old. And these are their 2 tombs in Westminster Abbey. This is Princess Mary's at the top with a recumbent figure on the side, and Princess Sophia's rather touchingly with this little crib on it, and you can still see those tombs if you go to Westminster Abbey today. Now, getting back to the aftermath of the Gunpowder plot and its discovery, this is a print of Guy Fawkes' night at Windsor Castle in about 1776, and you can see a tremendous bonfire in the middle there, and even the odd firework going off Celebrating that the king had survived, people lit bonfires all around London. And months later, the observance of the 5th of November Act was passed by Parliament, which enforced an annual public day of thanksgiving for the plot's failure. Within a few decades, Gunpowder Treason Day, as it was known, became the predominant English state commemoration. As it carried strong Protestant religious overtones, it also became a focus for anti-Catholic sentiment. Puritans delivered sermons regarding the perceived dangers of popery, whilst during increasingly raucous celebrations, common folk burnt effigies of popular hate figures such as the Pope. Towards the end of the 18th century, reports appear of children begging for money with effigies of Guy Fawkes, and 5th of November gradually became known as Guy Fawkes Day. Towns such as Lewes and Guildford were in the 19th century scenes of increasingly violent class-based confrontations, fostering traditions those towns celebrate still, albeit peaceably. In the 1850s, changing attitudes resulted in the toning down of much of the day's anti-Catholic rhetoric, and the observance of 5th of November Act was repealed in 1859. But of course, the tradition of lighting bonfires continued, and this in fact is the Staines bonfire on the 5th of November 1935, and you can just about see there's a large effigy of Guy Fawkes on the top here. You can judge the scale of it by the size of people standing alongside. Absolutely huge bonfire. So eventually the violence of the celebrations was suppressed, and by the 20th century, Guy Fawkes Day had become an enjoyable social commemoration, although lacking much of its original focus. The present day Guy Fawkes Night is usually celebrated at large organised events. Until recently, children used to make guys and take them around the neighbourhood in an old pram or similar with cries of penny for the guy. Here the idea was taken up by Staines Cottage Hospital between the wars as a fundraising idea, and you can see that this lorry with a huge effigy of Guy Fawkes and several nurses from the hospital in attendance and people carrying boxes to collect donations in are in the market square with the old Staines Town Hall in the background there. Now, Lord Knyvett died on the 27th of July 1622, and he's buried with his wife in Stanwell Parish Church. Above their grave, in the chancel of the church, is a large monument, as you see, where effigies of Lord Knyvett and his wife. Now, this is Lord Knyvett's school where we are this evening, and in his will, Thomas Lord Knyvett endowed the school with lands worth £20 a year. The land purchased comprised some 57 acres in Great and Little Kimble in Buckinghamshire and still belonged to the trustees in 1940. The school was built in 1624 by Elizabeth Hampden, the executrix of Knyvett's widow, at her own expense. Soon after it was founded, Dr. Heather gave it £2 a year for the purchase of books and paper, and Dorothy Leach, apparently a servant of Elizabeth Hampden, gave £10 a year to apprentice 2 boys from the school. Both these sums were still being received in 1940, although the apprenticing fund had for many years been used for further education. In 1646, the schoolmaster was sequestered by Parliament for drunkenness. The school had apparently fallen into a bad state under him, but a successor was appointed and the building was repaired. In 1813, the building was in bad repair. The apprenticing fund was not being used, and the master was receiving only £24 a year in addition to his house, although the value of the school estate had risen. The number of boys in the school had fallen from 60 or 70 to under 6. Following proceedings in Chancery, a new master was appointed, and until the cost of the proceedings had been paid, his salary was raised by private subscription. By 1823, there were 39 free boys in the school. Both they and the master were appointed, according to the founder's will, by the Lord of Stanwell Manor, who continued through the century to play an important part in running the school. In 1823, the master also took 10 paying pupils, but this practice seems to have been stopped soon after. The school did not receive any state aid until 1873, by which time 55 boys were in attendance. Fees of a penny to twopence were charged in 1877, apparently for the first time. The school building was extended probably in about 1885 and attendance remained at about 70 to 100 until 1937, although the seniors were moved to Woodthorpe Road School, Ashford, in 1932. In 1938, Lord Knyvett's was transferred to Middlesex County Council, and the endowment was thereafter set aside for assisting Stanwell children to obtain further education. In 1955, the Town Farm County Primary School was opened, and Lord Knyvett's School became part of it, taking 2 classes. It was closed in the 1960s and became an adult education centre. This is the actual foundation tablet with the arms of Knyvett and Hayward, his wife's maiden name. And you can see the date there that the school was founded, 1624. And this is a picture of the school later in existence, with obviously the pupils lining the playground. And you can see here, this is the extension that was added on. So this portion here was the large school hall, and the portion on the right was the schoolmaster's house. So obviously a playground, etc., out the back. And this is the building today. It was listed grade 2-star in 1946. It is now owned by the A2 Housing Association. The schoolmaster's house on the right is a home, and the hall and small adjoining classroom are leased by the Local Conversation in Stanwell, which is a People's Health Trust initiative, which involves supporting residents to develop a shared vision for their community and take local action on issues that matter to them. The name of the school itself lives on at the Thomas Knyvett College in Ashford. Now, we're all familiar with the fireworks that are still let off on Guy Fawkes Night and Bonfire Night, and several days, it must be said, either side of it. But many people will be familiar with at least the first line of this poem called Quintus Novembris, and was written by the poet John Milton, who interestingly lived nearby at Horton near Raysbury between 1632 and 1638. He wrote it in 1626 when he was only 17 at Cambridge University. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and the parliament. 70 barrels of powder below, poor old England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched, with a dark lantern and burning match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king.